According to the latest numbers, BRICS, BRICS, has overtaken the G7 in global GDP. This has never happened before, and for the first time, the G7 is not the most richest bloc in the world. Now, what does this mean? BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This is a bloc of countries that created an organization to counter the G7, especially in terms of financing and trade. The G7 countries include the United States, Canada, France, Italy, the UK, Japan, Germany. Currently, they account for 30% of global GDP. And this has been the case for the last 200 years. This means that they dominate global finance and global banking. What this means for poor countries like Kenya is that you cannot get a loan. Previously, you could not get a loan without first going through the G7 countries. And they used that power and they wielded that power to oppress very many poor countries and force them into trade deals that were very unequal and were very unfair to poor countries. And there was no one to challenge them because there was no alternative financing in the world until the rise of the BRICS. Now, the BRICS account for a much larger share of the GDP. Now, what this meant was that the BRICS can now finance poor countries without having to go through the G7. And slowly by slowly, there's a movement and there's pressure to move away from the US dollar because the US dollar allows the Americans to put countries on sanctions and oppress them and suppress them and dominate them. So the rise of BRICS is an alternative power center, especially financially and through trade. And this is good news for a poor country and an unproductive country like Kenya. It is projected that by 2030, BRICS will account for 50% of global GDP. And as a matter of fact, Mexico and other countries are applying to join the BRICS, which means that over time they will expand. We know that the G7 may not necessarily expand because of the racism, or it's very racially based upon ethnic Europeans. The only non-Europeans that have been allowed in the G7 are the Japanese, who are considered honorary white people. And so given the racial origins of the G7, other countries that are not ethnically European are usually not allowed to join. Now for BRICS, it allows anyone to join regardless of your racial background, which means more countries will join it than are able to join the G7. So we expect that the BRICS will grow not only in terms of number of participating countries, but also in terms of global GDP output. And this is for the first time that the West will be actually challenged on the financial front. What does this mean for Kenya? This means that we'll be able to have alternative sources of financing. And this has already been happening. I mean, a lot of the financing that is doing a lot of the infrastructural development in Kenya comes from the non-Western countries. For example, one of our biggest financier is the Africa Development Bank, which is controlled and has a majority of shareholding by Nigeria. So a lot of our financing comes from Nigeria, even though you'd never hear about it in the news media. Now, even as these tremendous things are happening globally, the Kenyan economy continues to lag and fall behind other economies. Kenya had become one of the top African economies, but now we are simply going backward. We continue to underperform, and as of March of this year, Kenya has been overtaken by Angola and also by Ethiopia in terms of productivity and economic output, in terms of the GDP. So as other African countries focus more and more on production and manufacturing, Kenyans are focused more and more on watching Arsenal, discussing useless things about Hollywood, instead of us manufacturing and increasing the manufacturing share of our GDP. We are focused on importing trinkets and used goods from the West. For example, you remember Raila saying that we should focus on textiles, on producing our own textiles as a foundation step in increasing our manufacturing and increasing our national GDP and our national output. And he said it's better that we have a textile industry than importing, used clothes from the West. And he was shouted down by the men of Kenya, who condemned and cursed him for suggesting that we should have factories rather than retailing used clothing. So the people were telling Raila very rudely that they'd rather be hawkers of foreign products than be factory workers. And this is the feeling amongst most Kenyans. that they prefer anything that is imported over anything that is domestically made. So there is no rise in manufacturing in Kenya. There is no rise of brands that are owned by Kenyans. Literally, the entire economy is divided between Indians and foreigners, other foreigners like Europeans and Chinese. There is virtually no local production by African men in Kenya. So in Kenya, once you arrive in Kenya, one of the things that you'll notice about all our towns is that they are simply divided into slums and churches. So any town you go is a slum, and then that has churches. Because the only thing that Kenyan men found, the only business that Kenyan men create are churches. That's it. Even abroad, even when you go to the Kenyan diaspora abroad, the only business they start is churches, nothing else. You won't find any other organization that Kenyans have created abroad. Just churches, in which of course they worship European statues and that sort of thing. So because of this national culture of self-rejection and self-hatred, then there's no manufacturing. There's no great rise of there's no rise of great brands that are made in Kenya by Kenyans. So now this culture is beginning to catch up with us as all other countries are beginning to exceed us. People keep on mocking Tanzania, people keep on mocking Uganda, but I'm telling you, over the next 10 to 12 years, not only will they catch up with Kenya, they will also exceed Kenya in terms of their GDP. While Kenyans are focused on wearing used clothing from the West, while Kenyans are focused on discussing whether Arsenal will win the next match. So this tragic culture, for a long time, Kenyans were boastful that they were a bigger economy than the small surrounding countries. But these small surrounding countries are beginning to catch up with us. And even a poor country like Ethiopia, which only accounted for a quarter of Kenya's GDP 15 years ago, not only has caught up, but has also surpassed Kenya. Angola, which went through a civil war for a long, long time, a brutal, horrific civil war, not only has it caught up with Kenya, it has also exceeded Kenya. So unless we change this national culture with great urgency, and this is an appeal to men, Kenyan men, that we have to begin to participate in manufacturing. We cannot allow Indians to continue to own everything. We cannot allow Europeans and Americans and Chinese to continue to own every single brand in Kenya. It's time we stopped this very negative culture of self-hatred and self-rejection. It's time we literally got serious. Otherwise, we'll be left last by all other African countries. All other poor countries are beginning to stack up their money. They're beginning to become wealthy. It cannot be that we as Kenyan men, we remain the poorest men in Africa. And I know you may think this is an exaggeration, but it's not. I want you to think about it. Kenya has the biggest slum in Africa. We are famous for having the largest slum in Africa. And this is a country that hasn't gone through a civil war. That in 60 years of flag independence, the only thing we've managed to accomplish is to have the biggest slum in Africa. Now, if you combine all the slums in Nairobi, they'd be the biggest slum in the whole world. So for how long are we going to continue to be famous for being the biggest slum dwellers in Africa? Even a country like Somalia doesn't have as big of a slum like Kenya. Countries that are under civil war. Even a country like Congo. Endless war, endless troubles, political instability, but they still don't have the biggest slum in Africa. Kenya, and only Kenya, is number one in having slum dwellers. So the poor countries are beginning to become rich. They're beginning to move forward and to replace the West as globally dominant countries, while Kenyans are too busy discussing inane and unhelpful and useless things to notice that we are being left behind.